Hello, everyone. Welcome to this lecture at the end of the semester for the Tang Center for Silk Road Studies. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Meghan Howard today. And indeed, it has been my pleasure to have known Meghan for some 8 years now, since she first applied to our Ph.D. program in the group in Buddhist Studies here at UC Berkeley. Meghan completed her BA at Harvard, where she majored in Tibetan and Himalayan studies and graduated magna cum laude. Her BA thesis received high honors and frankly reads more like a master's thesis. But to get to the beginning of her studies, the real beginning, one has to look all the way back to when she was 11 years old. She told me that this is when she first started studying the Tibetan language. And then some years later at Harvard, she began Sanskrit as an undergraduate in her freshman year and spent her sophomore year, I think it was, learning Chinese in Taiwan, finally graduating with a citation in modern Chinese language. So she graduated from Harvard with 3 languages under her belt already. After Harvard, Meghan embedded herself in Tibetan communities, doing research and working as a professional translator. In 2007, she moved to the newly established Center for Himalayan and Tibetan Studies in northern India, where she embarked on a 4-year project to translate a recently published study on the early Tibetan history, written by the great polymath Lama Drikung Chetsang Rinpoche. Really daunting in its scope, this book represents the insights of a traditionally trained Tibetan Lama and scholar into the historical significance of the manuscripts discovered at Dunhuang. So it's quite a unique and interesting study. The quality of the resulting translation that Meghan produced, sorry, I got distracted by the chat. The quality of this translation led us to accept Meghan directly into our PhD program, despite her not having completed a formal master's degree. At Berkeley, Meghan's fascination with Buddhist studies and, with Buddhist studies and Buddhism on the Silk Road in particular, has really continued unabated. While excelling in our Sanskrit seminars, she immersed herself in sinology, enrolling in and auditing all sorts of courses taught by professors Michael Nyland, Robert Ashmore, Mark Csikszentmihalyi, Terry Kleeman, Jan Nattier, and others. And then beyond her basic coursework, she has since added modern Japanese and even a dose of Sogdian and Khotanese. So she's truly a scholar, a scholar of the Silk Road, and we're lucky to have her here. For her dissertation, Howard's now studying the history of Buddhist cultural exchange along the Silk Road, with a particular focus on the writings of Fachung, or in Tibetan, Gochodrup, assuming that's the same person, which Meghan will finally be able to decide, maybe. The Silk Road is, of course, known for having facilitated all sorts of cultural exchange, yet strangely, almost all of the scholarship on this famous library cave of Dunhuang remains firmly embedded in particular cultural fields, mostly sinology or Tibetology. And Fachung is the best documented figure, I think, is safe to say, from medieval Dunhuang, making his intellectual biography a topic that really cries out for comprehensive study. And yet few have had the training necessary to really do him justice. With her remarkable training in languages and her enthusiasm for learning, Meghan's project promises to, I think, really set a new standard for Dunhuang studies in terms of cross-cultural studies. So Meghan's talk today is the result of her being the winner of the 2019 to 20 Leon Clancy Scholarship. As such, she was meant to deliver this lecture a year ago, but for obvious reasons, the event was postponed. Maybe I should just mention in passing that this year's holder of the Leon Clancy Scholarship Max Brandstadt will be speaking a week from today, I think, even at the same time. And the title of his talk is A Lost Buddhist Sect at Dunhuang, the Three Levels Movement in the Dunhuang document. So we will hear some more about Dunhuang. For today, we're finally able to hear Meghan's thoughts on the topic at hand. The title of her talk is Prophecy in Time and Place, reading the prophecy of the Arhat of Khotan as a ring composition. So thanks for coming, Meghan, and the floor is yours.
Thanks, Jake, for such a kind introduction. And I'd also like to thank Sanjo, Frank, Karen, and Sky for their patience in rescheduling this talk twice. I also want to take the opportunity, because I basically have been away from campus since the Tang Center opened. So I just wanted to thank the Tang family for their generous endowment that created the center, and also thank Sanjo for dreaming the dream for so long. And also everyone else at Berkeley and elsewhere, I'm sure, who's contributed in big and small ways to this endeavor. And then I'd like to particularly thank the Clancy family for their financial support and all the encouragement that offered to my work. So, and I also wanted to start today. I'm going to be talking about these existential threats faced by the Khotanese people more than 1,000 years ago. But I feel obliged to acknowledge that as we speak, the Uyghurs and other so-called ethnic minorities, living in Khotan, Kashgar, Kucha, and these places in the modern world are facing circumstances every bit as dire, if not more so. And I'm also alarmed to hear reports that these similar policies are starting to be implemented in Tibetan areas. And so in light of that, I'd also just like to mention the 167 Tibetans who have set their bodies on fire since 2009, and whose sacrifices have been met largely by silence on the part of the rest of the world. So, the responsibility for these brutal, genocidal, colonial policies rests squarely on the shoulders of the Chinese Communist Party. But I do believe that it is incumbent upon scholars of the Silk Roads to reflect on how the narratives we tell, I think, at least in my case, about rupture and continuity, and about things like exotic trade routes and extinct cities, how these touch the lives of people who are very much alive today. So I just didn't know how I could give the talk without addressing that. So during the reign of the seventh king of Khotan, Vijayakirta, a Buddhist monk asked his teacher about the eventual demise of the Buddhist teachings in our world. The Arhat replied, 2,000 years after Shakyamuni Buddha's parinirvana, his teachings will disappear from the face of the earth. As this point in time approaches, the Buddhist Sangha will fall on hard times, finding themselves bereft of patronage, forced to flee the devastation of war, and banished from Khotan, Tibet, and Gandhāra in quick succession. Finally, the remnants of the Sangha will be invited to Kauśāmbī, where a dispute will break out, triggering a fratricidal orgy of violence with no survivors. Thus will the Buddha Dharma disappear from Jambudvipa, only to return with the coming of Maitreya 500 million years in the future. This tale of the Sangha's final travails comes to us in a text known to scholars as the prophecy of the Arhat of Khotan. And in this talk, I'm going to refer to it as the prophecy. So although it was most likely a Khotanese composition, the Khotanese is unknown. It appears in Tibetan in the Tenjur and in 3 Dunhuang manuscripts. You can see all of that on the slide here. And it also appears in Dunhuang in Chinese, in a Chinese manuscript, which has since been included in the Taisho as Taisho 2090. So the first manuscript on my list here, IOL Tib J, which I'm going to call ITJ, refers to Dunhuang manuscripts in the British Library's collection. So ITJ 601 preserves a recension that is quite close to the Tenjir version, the Tibetan canon version, and it appears on paleographical grounds to be the oldest witness, perhaps dating to the first half of the 9th century. Because it appears to be both the earliest surviving manuscript and the earliest recension of the text, I have used ITJ 601 as the base for my study of the prophecy. A second recension, or perhaps a separate translation, is preserved by ITJ 597, ITJ 598, and the Chinese translation. ITJ 597 appears to be a 10th century copy of 598, which may date to the mid-9th century. So the Chinese manuscript, in addition, attributes the translation to Fa Cheng, also known as Chudrup, his Tibetan name, an important monk and Sino-Tibetan translator active around Dunhuang in the 9th century. And this makes the Chinese version of the prophecy one of the very few instances of translation from Tibetan to Chinese, despite a great number of translations in the opposite direction during the late first millennium. Based on the form of Fa Cheng's title on the manuscript, PC 2139, which is the PC stands for Paléo-Chinois. So PC and PT manuscripts are from the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris. PC 2139 most likely dates to between 848 and 860. So regarding the date of composition, paleographical evidence, and the attribution of the Chinese translation to Fa Cheng give us an endpoint of 864 or so at the latest, although it's likely something more like 860. But anyway, as far as Tibetan manuscripts go, this is a very, this is a Chinese manuscript, but still a Tibetan text tied to a Tibetan text. This is a very close, narrow window. So thus we can narrow the window of composition to a rather respectable 6-decade period between 802 and 864. One scholar has recently argued that this window should be further narrowed to the 850s, but I do not believe the evidence warrants such a conclusion, at least at this time. We can conservatively say that the text was composed in the early to middle 9th century, and at least 2 of the manuscripts were produced very close to the date of composition. So it is important to note that the prophecy is one of a group of 6 texts. And then this is a lot of information on this slide, but just to give you an overview, is one of a group of 6 texts concerning Khotan that survive in Tibetan. It is beyond the scope of this paper to give a full overview of this group of texts, but a few observations are in order. All of these texts appear in the Tibetan canon, save the religious annals of Khotan, down here in number 6, which is known only through a Dunhuang manuscript, PT 960. So the prophecy is attested both in Dunhuang and in the canon. And the Dunhuang fragments of the Mount Grosshinga prophecy here have recently been identified by Julie Shuang. So in other words, we have 2 texts that are attested in both the canon and in Dunhuang. These texts are variously considered by scholars to have been composed in Khotan or in Dunhuang, in Sanskrit, Khotanese, or Tibetan. However, all of them come to us now in Tibetan, and the prophecy of the Arhat of Khotan also has a Chinese translation. Central themes are the history of Buddhism and Buddhist sites in Khotan, frequently related in the form of prophecy. The 6 texts present a constellation of overlapping material that is related with significant differences between versions. In addition to the prophecy, 2 other texts relate the Sangha's end-time misadventures. And that would be number 5, the prophecy of the Arhat Sanghavardhana, and number 6, the religious annals of Khotan. Additionally, several of the texts, including the prophecy, are closely linked to the Chandragarbha Sutra, in which the Buddha prophesies a 2,000-year dispensation for his teachings, ending with a fratricidal bloodbath in Kauśāmbī. And of course, that sutra and its story, the Kauśāmbī story, has been studied at length by Jan Nattier in her Once Upon a Future Time. So with these background details established, what does the prophecy say? Let us look at an outline of the text. So it's a little bit hard to find a good map for all the regions that are going to come into this, but this one I think will do. So I've highlighted these 3 sites in the Tarim Basin here: Khotan, Kashgar, and Kucha. At the start of the text, the external narrative frame is introduced and set in time and place. 7 generations after the founding of Khotan, during the reign of the king Vijayakirta, in the probably Satkaya Giri Valley, next to probably Satkaya Prahana Monastery, a bhikshu disciple, having read the prophecy of the Dharma's decline in the Chandragarbha Sutra, asks his teacher, the Arhat Sanghavardhana, how long the Buddha Dharma and stupas will remain in Khotan, Kucha, and Kashgar. The Arhat praises the question and then responds that they will remain 2,000 years and then disappear. So he continues, the 3 lands of Khotan, Kucha, and Kashgar will be beset by non-Buddhist Han, red-faced, referring to the Tibetans, Supiyas, Turks, and Uyghurs. Kucha and Kashgar and their Buddhist monuments will be destroyed, and their sanghas will flee to Khotan. Then we get a section on Khotan and Tibet. 500 bodhisattvas will emanate to protect the Dharma in Khotan. So everyone from Kucha and Kashgar flees to Khotan, and then we get a little piece about Khotan. 500 bodhisattvas will emanate to protect the Dharma in Khotan, which will be visited by all the Buddhas of this aeon. Foreign kings will compete for Khotan, and the victor will patronize the Dharma. At that time, the king of Tibet will expand his territory by force, and a bodhisattva will be born as the Tibetan king. He will establish Buddhism in his realm, patronizing it extensively. Because he rules Khotan, Buddhism will flourish there. The Tibetan kings will be Buddhists for 7 generations, and they will not molest Buddhist shrines in other realms. At that time, as prophesied by the Chandragarbha Sutra, the faith of the Khotanese Sangha will weaken, and their worldly entanglements will increase. They will engage in political intrigue and misuse the property of the 3 jewels, and the king and ministers will be displeased and lose faith. Later on, a bodhisattva will be the 7th king of Tibet. He will marry a Chinese princess who is also a bodhisattva. The king and queen will both be devout patrons of the Dharma. And at that time, a young non-Buddhist king of Khotan will order the Sangha to disrobe or leave Khotan. And the Sangha will convene in Tsar or Tsarma monastery to discuss what to do. So at this point, some of the monks will disrobe. The Sangha who are leaving will depart Khotan for Tibet, taking emotional leave of their families and stopping off at various points. Let's see. Oh, there. So everyone's in Khotan. Then from Khotan, here's what happens next. Stop off at various points along the route out of Khotan, and they will receive several miraculous provisions of gold and jewels from divine beings who are basically protectors of different religious sites. And then using these provisions, such as 7 golden plates of gold dust, a golden bowl full of pearls, a sleeve or a small bag, I guess, or maybe a large bag full of gold coins, and so forth. At one point, so they use these as provisions for their travels. At one point, Vaishravana and Sri Devi will emanate as husband and wife to make offerings to the Sangha for a full fortnight. And then finally, as they take their leave, they basically approach the Tibetan border at Pashan. So I hope to have time to return to Pashan. But anyway, the Sangha will be turned away from Tibet by the border sentry. But Vaishravana will assume the form of a yak with a saddle sore and a nose rope, which I think indicates that it has an owner, and that thus it's probably going home to its owner. And they will follow that yak, who will lead them over several days to the border crossing at Salji, which is not on this map, but it's here in the region of Charchen, modern day Charchen. The Tibetan king will learn of the refugees, and the Chinese queen will plead for them to be allowed into Tibet. Upon the king's ascent, both king and queen will go to receive the Sangha, posting sentries to watch for other refugee monks from Kucha, Kashgar, Brusha, and Kashmir. I guess Brusha isn't on the map, but it's over here in the a little bit north of Kashmir, which is, you can see Srinagar here in Kashmir Valley. So in any case, we're talking very much this Karakoram and Tarim area. After 3 or 4 years, the queen will die of a pox that appears on her heart. On her deathbed, she will ask the king to ordain her 600 attendants, and he will agree. The pox will spread, and many ministers and their family members will die in the outbreak. They will petition the king to banish the foreign monks, and the king will reluctantly agree. At this point, the Tibetan monks will threaten to leave with the foreign monks, but the ministers will call their bluff. And so all of the monks of Tibet and the Central Asian monks, along with a contingent of Chinese monks who have fled Taoist persecution, all of these will depart for Gandhāra, taking with them all of the relics, texts. Okay, so now we're traveling off to Gandhāra, all of the relics, texts, offering implements, and other property of the 3 jewels. With their departure, the Dharma will disappear from Tibet, China, India, and Khotan, and all other lands on the near side of the Ganges. On the far side of the Ganges, the Dharma will last a further 3 months in Kauśāmbī. There's a kind of maybe chronological contradiction here, because you'll see they're in Gandhāra for longer than 3 months, but anyway. At the edge of Gandhāra, so somewhere over here, maybe possibly following the Indus, across Western Tibet and then down into Gandhāra. At the edge of Gandhāra, the monks will encounter the Naga king Elapatra in the form of an old man who questions them about their provisions. The Sangha will not have enough food to reach Gandhāra by skirting the Great Lake. Taking pity on them, the Naga king will transform his body into a snake that bridges the lake, allowing for a direct path across. For 15 days, the Sangha will be able to cross until the Tibetan army cuts off the traffic. The snake, exhausted and bloodied, will fall into the lake and die to be reborn in Tushita, and then the lake will dry up. The king of Gandhāra will invite the Sangha to stay in his realm, but when he dies 2 years later, the Sangha will insert itself into the succession struggle, and eventually a bhikshu will usurp the throne, only to be assassinated, and the Sangha banished from the realm. Thus will the Dharma disappear from Gandhāra. At just that time, Kauśāmbī will be threatened by an alliance of 3 powerful kings, the king of the west, the king of the north, and the king of the Yavanas, referring to the Greeks. The king of Kauśāmbī will defend his realm, killing the 3 kings and 300,000 soldiers. In order to confess his sins, he will invite all the monks of Jambudvipa to his realm. Once gathered, a dispute will arise, and the monks will slaughter each other to the last man. The Dharma will disappear from Jambudvipa as prophesied in the Chandragarbha Sutra. 576 million years after the Buddha's parinirvana, Maitreya will come to the Saha world to benefit beings. So that's our tale here. Before going any farther, I would like to tether this narrative to a few historical people, places, and events, to the degree that is possible. Torn between time limitations and the pleasures of taking a learned audience into the weeds, or the desert sands, if you will, I would be happy to return to any of these points during the Q&A, and I've just chosen just a really small number to kind of look at. The prophecy, so first I want to talk about the frame. The prophecy is given during the reign of the 7th king of Khotan, Vijayakirta. So this is kind of like a Khotanese accent on the Sanskrit name Vijayakirti. And there are several kings of Khotan that have this name in the records, both Tibetan canonical records, and also there's at least one Vijayakirti who appears in Khotanese documents, Vishakirti. So it's hard to know which king we might be talking about, but it is suggestive, to say the least, to note that a Vishakirti or Vijayakirti is the 57th king by at least one count, and he came to the throne in 804. So in other words, was the author of the prophecy linking past with present? Was he embedding the present in the past? Was he playing on this? I don't know, but there is this interesting link between the name of the king when the prophecy is given, presumably in the distant past, and then the name of the king at the time of the text composition. So next I want to talk about this question about, and I'm not sure with my Zoom, yeah, there. So here, Kashgar is up here, Kucha is up here, and then, you know, really all the action is taking place down here in Khotan. But I'd like to talk about Kashgar and particularly Kucha for a minute. So in the prophecy, Buddhism's demise is set in motion by the sacking of Shulik and Ansei. And just sticking with the Tibetan text for a moment. And their Sanghas flee to Khotan. So Shulik is actually an ancient name for Kashgar, and it's similar in Chinese. It's Shula, which presumably would have sounded something like Shulik around the time of the Tang Dynasty. So the interpretation of Ansei is less straightforward. So the Kashgar piece is pretty much clear, but in his translation, Fachang renders Ansei as Anshi, and I just realized I didn't put in a slide with the characters for everyone to see, but those of you who know Chinese presumably will be able to follow this. So in other words, Fachang renders Ansei as Anshi, which is the Chinese name for Parthia. At least one scholar has suggested that the non-Buddhist invasion of Kashgar and Parthia in our narrative could reflect the Umayyad campaigns against Transoxiana in the early and middle 8th century. So Transoxiana being kind of this area here, maybe a little bit north, but definitely further west of Gandhāra. So, so we have Arab invasions basically of Central Asia in the middle 8th century. Maybe, you know, maybe that's what Parthia is referring to here. So then we would have Kucha, we would have Kashgar and Parthia being invaded by non-Buddhists and their monks fleeing to Khotan. Other scholars, most prominently Jan Nattier, have preferred Anshi, Anshi meaning the pacified West. So the territory of the Tang Protectorate of the pacified West. So this was like a Tang administrative unit that more or less maps onto the Tarim Basin. So this term Anshi could refer to the entire administrative unit, but by metonymy, it also referred to the protectorate's seat. The protectorate's seat moved around during the Tang Dynasty, but most of the time, and most likely for our purposes, it would be referring to Kucha. Going one step further, Warner Bellinger has connected the prophecy's account of the destruction in Kucha and Kashgar with two Khotanese evacuation orders that, as Yoshida Yutaka first recognized, were issued in response to Uyghur incursions into the Tarim in 798 and 802, respectively. So this is quite beautiful because we have dated documents saying, you know, get everyone into the fort because the Huna, who Yoshida has demonstrated, or most likely the Uyghurs, are coming. So I believe that Ansei can be firmly identified with Kucha. First, on phonological grounds, we expect that Anshi as Parthia would be transcribed with a final stop along the lines of Ansik. And Ansei, which is what we get in the Tibetan, is a better fit for Anshi, meaning Kucha. And indeed, this is confirmed by several Chinese texts written in Tibetan transcription in Dunhuang. So we have these very interesting manuscripts in Dunhuang of Chinese texts written out in Tibetan pronunciation using the Tibetan script. So, and indeed, here we have this so-called catechism, Mahayana catechism. It's asking about the 4 elements, and it's connecting the element of fire, I guess, with the breath. And so this character that is in the name for Parthia is right here because it also is the word for breath. And we see that it is transcribed in one Tibetan manuscript as sik, and in another Tibetan manuscript with an a prefix, ao sagigusiga sik. So in any case, we have 2 attestations of this character being transcribed with a final stop. So really, we expect that Parthia should be transcribed as Ansik. And then furthermore, we have a Chinese version of the smaller Sukhavati Vyuha Sutra, the Fosho Amito Jing, which is in Tibetan transcription. And in here, we see, here I actually did remember to write it out. So here you can see up here, this is this say, and right here, say corresponding to she for west. So in other words, what we expect on historical phonological grounds is indeed what we find, to the extent that we have records of Tibetan transcription of Chinese words. Then next, the second part of my argument is that the Tibetan use of Ansei to refer to Kucha is attested in Dunhuang sources. So it appears in particular in the biographical account of the master Artan Huer, who traveled from India to Ansei, and whose direct disciple Busing was active in the Dunhuang region. So we have this master who comes from India, and he comes to Ansei. Again, not necessarily clear where Ansei is, but we know that his disciples keep moving east. So his direct disciple spends his life around the Dunhuang area. That disciple's disciple, I believe, is in Tsongkha. In any case, within a few generations, the whole lineage is centered in Tsongkha. So we're moving east. So again, the idea of being Parthia is way far west. Kucha is more in the neighborhood. But again, what I find really interesting is this passage. Reaching the age of 100, the master passed beyond time in the posture of nirvana. So probably lying on his side. Then the king of Ansei threw himself on the ground and said, "The master explained the Dharma to so many sentient beings, but has he departed without teaching even a few words to me?" 3 days after he passed away, he rose again, taught the Dharma to the king of Ansei, Kwatsiwang, and passed beyond time. So, I mean, this passage I think is just so cool for so many reasons. But today I'm going to talk about maybe the most boring reason, which is that this line at the very end, King of Ansei Kwatsiwang. So who's King of Ansei Kwatsiwang? Well, Wang is clearly, I think, a transcription of the Chinese Wang for king. As Paul Pelliot pointed out, early Chinese names for Kucha suggest an original pronunciation of Kutsi. So not cha, but ca, or not, and also not, and also with the vowel, so tsi. So in other words, working back from Chinese historical phonology, we expect that the kind of local original name of Kucha was something along the lines of Kutsi. And this is I believe that this Kwatsi must reflect an ancient local name for Kucha, and probably refracted through Chinese. So in essence, what we have is the king of Ansi, i.e. Kucha, king of Kucha. So in this text, we have king of Kucha, I would say. And so I think that it's quite clear that we should interpret Ansi as Kucha. Okay, then let's see where we are with time. I think I'm just unfortunately going to summarize most of this. It's really fun stuff, but I want to get to the main argument at the end of the paper. So, but please feel free to ask about this in the Q&A. I'd be happy to go back to it. So the main point here is that as the Sangha leaves Khotan, we can trace their travels. We can, to some degree, put them directly on a map. And they seem to be moving along a recognized trade route. So in other words, the person writing this text or composing this was familiar with Khotanese geography. And we can't necessarily say that for the other lands that appear in the text, but the Khotanese part it's very clear, it's very detailed and pretty accurate. There's one question that I have about this Pashan, which is where they encounter the Tibetan border. They get turned away at Pashan, and then they enter here at Salji. I'm sorry, it's quite small. But so Salji is a known administrative unit of the Tibetan Empire. So they had a big, garrison, and Miran, where so many Tibetan documents have turned up, is here at Nupchungu, I think, maybe Nupchen, I'm sorry, I'm forgetting. But in any case, so the question I have with Pashan is apparently an early Chinese name for Charchen, which is right here and which is within the area of Salji. In other words, potential border crossing would be Charchen. The early Chinese name for this was Pashan, probably pronounced something like Pa-Xian or something. What we get in Fa Chang's translation is Poshan, which again, historical phonology was probably something more like Pa-Shan. But anyway, so the question is, then meanwhile, there's also this trade route that runs down this way across Aksai Chin into Tibet. So, and right here, there's a pass called Polur. So I'm just a little bit, they've been coming down this way, and then they're right at this pass, which could potentially be a border into Tibet. In any case, they get turned away. So either right here, they're turned away, or either right here, they're turned away. And then somehow, Vishravana as a yak shows up and leads them, into Salji. And from there, they go down into central Tibet. So anyway, that's probably more than we had time for anyway. The other points I wanted to make is just that the Tibetan episode, the kings of Tibet that are mentioned are to some degree recognizable. I mean, it's clear that we're talking about Songtsen Gampo, and we're talking about Tride Tsutsen, who's Mei Akzom, and we're talking about his Chinese queen, Jinchen Gongju. But the history is a little bit muddled. For instance, Songtsen Gampo died before Tibet took Khotan, so he never ruled Khotan. Things like this. There's a little bit of muddling going on, but some historical tethers there. Then there's a mention of Taoist persecution, which might be talking about Emperor Xuanzong, Li Longji in China. So yeah, anyway, we'll keep moving and maybe come back to this in Q&A. In the remainder of this study, I would like to sketch out the basic literary structure at work in the prophecy and ask what its implications may be. There are 7 main episodes in our text, So I've just kind of tried to lay it out here. 5 descriptions of quasi-historical events during the Sangha's sojourns in Kucha and Kashgar, then Khotan. And in this Khotan section, Tibet gets mentioned. We'll come back to that. Then we have trials and miracles on the road to Tibet. Then we have our time in Tibet. Then we have trials and miracles on the way to Gandhāra. We've got Gandhāra, Kauśāmbī, and then the closing. So we have these 5 quasi-historical episodes that are linked together by 2 extended descriptions of miraculous events and intercessors on the road to and from Tibet. Read in linear fashion, the story narrates the retraction of Buddhism from the far reaches of Central Asia and East Asia back to India, the land of its origin. The Sangha retraces the steps of its missionary forebears until every last monk has convened in Kauśāmbī, and then the lights go out. The Sangha's progression is clear enough, but the text seems to be constantly repeating itself, especially in the frequent descriptions of monarchs patronizing or persecuting Buddhism. In the middle of such a passage, one can lose track of which realm the Sangha is currently located in. And caught in the middle of this constant circling back, I recalled Mary Douglas's remark that, quote, "Whenever I read criticism of dire editorial confusion, my pulse quickens. I scent a hidden structure, probably a ring composition," unquote. I would like to propose that the prophecy of the Arhat of Khotan has been composed as a ring. In her Terry lectures on ring compositions, Mary Douglas outlines 7 formal conventions. So at its most basic, a ring composition is an elaboration of the chiastic pattern A, B, C, B, A. So in other words, it consists of an end that is brought back to a beginning. So really, I guess this should be B prime and A prime. So we have A coming back to A prime. It can be sliced into 2 halves. So you can read it as A, B, C, and then as C, B prime, A prime. In the first half, the motion is from the opening to the midturn, which is A to C, at which point it reverses and works back from the midturn to the ending, C to A prime. Yeah, here's the list. Maybe it's easier to follow with that. The episodes in each half correspond to parallel episodes in reverse order in the other half. So in other words, A is somehow going to refer to A prime, or they mutually refer to each other. B and B prime are going to mirror each other, and then C in the middle. These episodes are ideally clearly distinguishable as distinct sections and share key words or phrases with their counterpart to mark their parallel relation. Key to this structure is the midturn C, which must be clearly marked with reference to the opening and closing. In other words, C, A, and A prime all have to somehow reference each other to create this lock, thus integrating the various sections into a cohesive whole. In addition, the midturn, as the turning point, is loaded, as Mary Douglas puts it, with the central import of the work. Identifying the midturn thus carries important implications for the text's interpretation. So here's my breakdown of the prophecy as a ring. Turning to the prophecy, we see that it opens with a question about the decline of the Dharma in Central Asia. That's our prologue. And it closes with the complete disappearance of the Dharma from the world. That actually happens at the very end of B prime. And its reappearance at the time of Maitreya. So we've got sort of B prime and A prime kind of making the lock for us. Furthermore, both the opening and closing passages reference explicit times and places. The midturn comes in Tibet with the smallpox epidemic. So that's down here. Although E does not directly reference A or A prime, in the case of the prophecy, it is the tipping point for the Sangha's fortunes in the world. That a shift has occurred is evidenced by the fact that from Tibet onwards, Each quasi-historical section ends with a statement identifying the parts of the world now permanently bereft of Dharma. So we find this sentence closing E, C prime, and B prime. Such statements could easily have appeared at the end of episodes B and C, for instance, but they do not. Furthermore, the events in E, in Tibet, are set off from the other historical episodes by the two flanking sections describing magical events on the road, so D and D prime, which interrupt the historical tone of the other sections. The structure pairs the events in Kucha and Kashgar, B, with those in Kauśāmbī, B prime. Those in Khotan, C, with Gandhāra, C prime. And the journey to Tibet, D, with the journey to Gandhāra, D prime. In episode B, three lands, Kucha, Kashgar, and Khotan, are threatened by marauding kings of different nations, while in B prime, three marauding kings of the north, the west, and the Yavanas threaten Kauśāmbī. In B, the Sangha leaves Kashgar and Kucha in the wake of their devastation. In B prime, the Sangha gathers in Kauśāmbī to help atone for the devastation of war, yet they end up slaughtering each other. In D and D prime, the Sangha faces obstacles crossing a border, and in both cases finds help from a magical being in animal form. In D, we are told of a series of provisions of precious substances that sustain the Sangha for months at a time. When they are denied entry to Tibet, Vaishravana, in the form of a white yak, leads them to a different entry point where they are welcomed into Tibet. In D prime, the Sangha is being chased by the Tibetan army and does not have enough provisions to reach Gandhāra until Elapatra manifests as a snake bridge that they are able to cross. For what it is worth, both the yak and the snake have sores on their backs, and both are, in their original form, old men, a Nagaraja and Vaishravana. And both are important Dharma protectors of Central Asia. The main point of resonance between C and C prime is the theme of the Sangha meddling in political affairs, which backfires and results in their banishment from Khotan and Gandhāra, respectively. Both realms also suffer political chaos under young monarchs. And then rings within rings are a common feature of ring compositions. An episode C itself turns out to be a mini ring in which Tibet and Khotan alternate. So here we have our mini ring. So we have, in this passage, which is one of the most kind of confusing to read through, the Dharma flourishes in Khotan. Then we have, Tibetan power is on the rise and they become Buddhist. Then we have the Dharma wanes in Khotan with a reference to the Chandragarbha Sutra. Then we go back to Tibet, where the Tibetan king has married a Chinese princess. And then we go here where the Sangha is finally expelled from Khotan. So in this mini ring, without the ring structure, the alternation between Khotan and Tibet feels confused and can make one's head spin. With the ring structure in place, it suddenly becomes clear that not only are the fates of the two realms intertwined, but Tibet's star is rising while Khotan's is setting. Now that the prophecy decline has begun, it is time for the Sangha to leave Khotan. The mention of the Chandragarbha prophecy in C3 confirms the identification of the ring structure. The Chandragarbha Sutra, as a vital influence behind the composition of the prophecy, fittingly is mentioned 3 times in our text. In the prologue, it inspires the bhikshu's question. In the conclusion, it confirms the terrible outcome in Kauśāmbī. And in C3, it underscores the thematic importance of the disappearance of the Dharma from Khotan. This is the thematic and lexical marking that we would ideally have found in the midturn at E in Tibet, but instead we find it in the mini ring C. So I will return to this problem in a minute. So returning to Mary Douglas's 7 conventions, let's go back here. We find that the prophecy opens with a prologue that, quote, sets the stage, tells of a doubt to be allayed, and is responded to by the ending. Or maybe, maybe you'd rather look at this slide. Number 2, it can be split into 2 halves. In the first half, the Sangha is exiled from Central Asia. In the second half, they return to India, to the prophesied site of Buddhism's destruction. Number 3, parallel sections can be identified in each half, as I just laid out. Number 4, sections are distinguished by geographical setting and narrative style. So one way to know, when C is ending and D starts is, that we move into this sort of magical, miraculous, happenings world. Number 5, as I will demonstrate below, the midturn E is loaded, again, Mary Douglas's term, with the text central message. Number 6, we find at least one ring within the main ring, which is C as a mini ring. And then finally, 7, the ending, A prime, answers the question posed in the prologue A with the same syntax and tone. And the kind of tone of the A and A prime is quite distinct from the narration of the rest of the text. So the prophecy thus observes all 7 of Douglas's conventions for ring compositions, yet it falls short of an ideal ring in 2 points. First, I'm going to jump ahead there. Here are 2 problems in terms of identifying it as a ring. First, there are few lexical markers appearing in parallel sections. So ideally, you would find like the same word, like a yak, and in a yak, or someone is carrying a basket, or I don't know. You can think of any number of options. But ideally, there's like a lexical marker that identifies the parallel, at least in rings studied in other parts of the world. In the absence of lexical markers, I have identified parallel passages mainly based on thematic content. It is my hypothesis that lexical markers may be missing from the text because they were literally lost in translation when the text was translated from Khotanese into Tibetan and then Chinese by translators who were not sensitive to the literary form. So that's a potential hypothesis. Second, the midturn does not directly reference the prologue or conclusion. So again, we want, A prime, and E to all match up, but we don't get that mention. What we seem to see matching with A and A prime is actually C3, and that's nowhere near the middle. However, it is the center of the mini ring. So the midturn does not directly reference the prologue or conclusion, though A and A prime form one of the clearest parallels in the text. Furthermore, A and B prime, do pick up the Chandragarbha reference in C3. So I will address both of these problems in a minute. So the identification of the prophecy's ring structure has several implications. Most immediately, it affects our evaluation of the text's literary qualities. Rather than being a rambling and sometimes confused linear narrative, the text is revealed to be a well-crafted story of decline. The pairing of the ring episodes helps to foreground this theme. The Sangha's linear journey from one land to the next can flatten the sense of doom, but although the Sangha appears to be moving horizontally through space, ring after ring closes with the melancholy refrain, "The Dharma disappeared from such and such lands." Even seemingly positive episodes reinforce the theme of loss and decline. Elapatra's bridge literally collapses into the lake, costing him his life, and the lake itself dries up. Of course, nothing can surpass passage B prime in Kauśāmbī, in which the monks slaughter each other, bringing an end to the dispensation of Buddha Shakyamuni. With the conclusion of each ring, a door to an alternative outcome closes, a path to a potential refuge is blocked, and the Sangha progressively empties out of Jambudvipa. The general theme of decline is clear enough, even when the presence of the rings remains unrecognized, but the structure helps to convey a more particular message regarding the fate of the Central Asian Sangha. The prophecy opens with a question about the duration of the Dharma in Central Asia, and it closes with the disappearance of the Dharma from all of Jambudvipa, in other words, from our entire world. The midturn E that is supposed to reference these two passages talks about the Sangha's exile in Tibet. Meanwhile, the description of the Dharma's decline in Khotan, C3, includes a reference to the Chandragarbha prophecy that marks it as parallel to A and A prime. It is a marking that we expect but do not get in E. So again, it's like what we're looking for, we find in C3, but where we really want it for a classic ring is down here. What are we to make of this conundrum? I believe the solution is to admit that the ring has two centers, E and C3. C3 is the text's thematic center, signaling its major focus, the plight of the Central Asian monks. E is the dramatic center, the tipping point in their fate. When the Sangha is expelled from Tibet, their days are numbered. This is further supported by the refrain closing E, C prime, and B prime that, again, the Dharma disappeared from such and such lands. So it turns out then that both rings, both the outer ring and our mini ring, circle around Tibet. Tibet's role at the midpoint can also be seen in the prophecy's temporal development. If we read episode B as referencing the Uyghur raids on the Tarim, as you know, that's basically the point of me arguing for Kucha, is that I think that the non-Buddhist invaders can be seen as a reference to Uyghurs. If we read episode B as referencing the Uyghur raids on the Tarim at the turn of the 9th century, and if we interpret the events in Tibet, episode E, as referring to a smallpox epidemic that claimed the life of the Chinese princess Jinchen Gongchu in 739 or 740, then the Sangha flees to Khotan and from there to Tibet 6 or 7 decades after they were banished from Tibet in the mid-8th century. Thus, the geographical retraction of Buddhism appears to be mirrored by a historical regression. This rewinding of history is even more striking if we identify Vijayakirta, the Khotanese king in whose reign the prophecy is narrated, with Vishakirti of the early 9th century. But again, such an identification is highly speculative. While the events in Gandhāra and Kauśāmbī may be built around historical kernels, by the time of the composition of the prophecy, they are mythic happenings of the distant past or future, if you want to read it. The events in Tibet, by contrast, may still be within living memory, and those in Central Asia are painfully fresh. This hierarchy of historicity is reflected in the prophecy's narration. In the Gandhāra and Kauśāmbī episodes, the only proper names we encounter are the kings of the West, the North, and the Yavanas, or the Greeks, which are taken directly from the Chandragarbha Sutra and are sufficiently vague to begin with. In Tibet, events are related with relative specificity, though the only protagonist to be named is referred to merely as Kongzhou, from the Chinese Gongju for princess. This contrasts sharply with Khotan, where we are given the name of a quasi-historical king and numerous names of identifiable places through which the Sangha sojourns. It is almost as if the realism stops at the border with Tibet. Thus, both geographically and temporally, it is Tibet at the midturn that helps to identify the Central Asian Sangha with the Sangha of the entire world. In the prophecy, Tibet stands at the geographic midpoint between Central Asia and India, between a particular band of monks facing a present exigency and the mythic history of the Sangha as a whole. Their banishment from Tibet thus transforms the Central Asian monks and their plight into a metonym for the Buddha Dharma's dispensation as a whole. In other words, Tibet forges the link between the Chandragarbha prophecy and its realization in Khotan. Seen in this light, the mini ring in section C, with its alternations between Tibet and Khotan, performs a double function of describing the decline of Dharma in Khotan while underscoring that Khotan's fate is intertwined with Tibet. But why should Tibet feature centrally in a text that is ostensibly about the disappearance of Buddhism from Khotan? During the prophecy's window of composition, Khotan was ruled by Tibet, which had recaptured it in the early Tibetan 790s. Moreover, less than a decade after falling to the Tibetans, with the Uyghurs pressing on Kucha to the north and Kashgar to the west, Khotan found itself threatened with yet another invasion. Seen in this light, the prophecy represents a Khotanese response to this tumultuous period, simultaneously addressing Khotanese anxieties and appealing to their Tibetan masters, as the Khotanese documents call them, for protection. It accomplishes this double objective with 3 rhetorical moves, and I'm almost done. First, the text reworks long-standing Khotanese prophetic traditions tied to the Chandragarbha Sutra in light of a new Uyghur threat. Local prophecy inspired by the Chandragarbha Sutra is evident already in the questions of Vimalaprabha, which may be as early as the mid-7th century. Thus, the author of the prophecy is drawing on a deeply rooted tradition to offer the Khotanese faithful an explanation of their precarious present. Second, by yoking the fall of Buddhism in Khotan to its ultimate disappearance from Jambudvipa as a whole, the prophecy positions Khotan as the center of the Buddhist world. This too is a persistent strategy in Khotanese Buddhism, one that was well established at least by Xuanzang's visit in 645. 3, the primary rhetorical import of this claim, the claim that Khotan is the center of the Buddhist world, is in paving the way for the text's 3rd move, namely, that by interweaving Khotan's fate with Tibet, Khotan is appealing to the Tibetans for protection, if not for Khotan's sake, then for the Buddha Dharma's sake. The prophecy is effectively saying, we in Khotan are key to the future of the Buddha Dharma. Threatened by the Uyghurs, we are dependent on you in Tibet for protection. Moreover, we have a history of being welcomed by you. Rather than being a true prediction of the end of the Dharma, the prophecy is a plea to the Tibetans to prevent such an outcome. There's much more that could be said about the dynamics at work and the relations between the Khotanese and Tibetans in the 9th century, but it will have to wait. Yeah, and also in the Q&A, if anyone wants to talk a bit about questions of authorship or the translations, Tibetan and Chinese translations, I have more to say about that too. But yeah, I've argued that the prophecy of the Arhat of Khotan is a ring composition, that recognition of this literary structure, when combined with internal textual evidence, allows us to more fully appreciate the text's literary merits and message. Read in this way, the prophecy emerges as an elegant response to Khotanese anxieties at the turn of the 9th century. So yeah, I think I've taken more time than I should have. So yeah, it's funny here because I don't know who I'm talking to, but I'm sure I have many friends and colleagues out there. I'd like to say thank you for listening to me. And
thank you, Meghan. That was very exciting. So we have some time for questions. If people want to write them in the Q&A tab at the bottom of the screen, you can do so, and I'll read them off. I guess I'm curious just to hear, you mentioned just in passing a side issue, which was that set of lineage biographies of this Central Asian Chan lineage.
Yeah.
And you mentioned that you were excited about this particular passage that you were using, I think, primarily to just show the name of Kucha.
Right.
But I'm curious if you have anything to add about some of the things you're excited about in that passage.
Okay, sorry, I'm lost on my computer screen here. I'll share my screen again. I mean, I find this lineage very interesting, and I just, I guess this probably came out in this talk. I love when you can take these manuscripts and then plot them on a map, so just the idea that we have a lineage that's moving and that it's moving east and it's ending up in Songkha, and I just love everything about that. But when I was, looking at this passage, it was really this part, the 3 days after he passed away, he rose again. And somehow that had not, I don't know if I noticed it in the past, it didn't stick with me, but when I looked at that, it's right here in the Tibetan Lar Sheng. It just seems so clear to me that he rose again, and I know that when, like in Marco Polo, when he goes through Kashgar, I think he talks about there being Nestorian Christians there. That's obviously quite a bit later, and it's Marco Polo and all that. But I find it hard to believe that there isn't some kind of Christian influence here. But I just saw this a few days ago, so I don't have much more to say about it. But if anyone listening has thoughts,
Thank you. Here's another question from the Q&A box. This from Alex. As for the Khotanese claim established by the time Xuanzang, by the time of Xuanzang, I guess, vis-a-vis Khotan to be the center of the Buddhist world, what about India, where Buddhism was alive and well at the time?
Oh, yeah. So maybe I didn't formulate that clearly, but what I'm saying is that, we see the same thing in Gandhāra. We see it, honestly, we see it in almost every Buddhist land where there are stories of the Buddha coming there and teaching, or, I guess in Tibet, it might be Guru Rinpoche, there's not a single inch of land that hasn't been touched by his feet. You hear people say things like that. But, in Gandhāra and in Khotan, they have all kinds of traditions about the Buddha actually visiting there. And so I would just, I think, don't we have the same for Swayambhu in the Swayambhu Purana? If I'm a little rusty on that, but, so this is just a general Buddhist thing. But my point was that, Xuanzang is reporting in 645 that there are places where the Buddha had come in Khotan and taught the Dharma and stuff. So that's it's just this idea of locating Buddhism, identifying your land as a holy land for Buddhism.
Alex is now adding to his question. If I may. He says, yes, the same claim comes in Nepal, but it comes when Buddhism has been lost in India. Oh, that's interesting. Well, again, we see it in Gandhāra, and I think I don't think that's at a point where Buddhism is, really on its way out in India yet. So, and also Khotan has a long, the Khotan Gandhāra connection is really interesting, and, Nia Prakrit and all these, the earliest writing we have in the region is Kauśāmbī. And, so again, I don't know, to what degree there are, actual influences from Gandhāra in Khotan, influencing that kind of tradition, but yeah. And just there's another follow-up question on this manuscript before we move away from it. Thank you, Meghan. May I please ask, who is the master who rose again after 3 days to teach the king of Anse in the picture?
Oh, yeah, I know. I just realized I didn't put his name on the slide. So he has this very funny name, Artan Huer. So if you read Tibetan, it's up here somewhere, right here. If you read Tibetan, it's right there. If you don't read Tibetan, it's A, and then second syllable is R-T-A-N. And then the third syllable is really bizarre from a Tibetan point of view, but it's H-Y-V-E-R, or maybe W-E-R, depending how you want to transcribe it. So it's Artan Huer. And I know that there are people who have argued, I think someone has argued that it's a Persian name. So it is a question like, what is this name? I think it's, again, I think maybe all the names of people and places in PT 996 are coming to us through Chinese. Again, it's probably a Chan lineage, so that would make sense that there, but, for instance, Busing is obviously a Chinese name, the next master in the lineage and so forth. And then I think after that, it's Man Hushang, who's also obviously Chinese. So the question is, the first guy, where did he come from? The text says he came from India, but yeah, it definitely could be a Persian name. It could be. I haven't really looked at it. So.
Thanks. Here's another question. Thank you for your presentation. Do some of the versions of this prophecy elaborate on the cause of the mutual slaughter of the Sangha in Kauśāmbī? Is this event also connected with the mingling of the Sangha with the political powers?
Yeah, actually, it does. If you, so I would direct you to Jan Natier's. She has a whole book on this, coming out of her doctoral dissertation, and there really is an emphasis on this tradition of the declinement of the Dharma. It really, in fact, at one point, Professor Natier argues that, or at least suggests that these prophecies of decline in the Indian side seem to arise not so much under, extreme circumstances where, the Buddha Dharma is actually greatly threatened, but more they seem to arise at times when the Buddha Dharma is flourishing, the monks are really getting involved in politics and maybe business, I don't know. But so there is definitely a link to political interactions. And in fact, in one of the versions of the Kauśāmbī prophecy, there's even in Gandhāra, when things are really about to, before they're on their way to Kauśāmbī, but as things are falling apart in Gandhāra, one of the monks actually assassinates the king and usurps the throne. So we even have a bhikshu murderer on the throne, So that theme is definitely there. And then in terms of what triggers this bloodbath, it's actually a dispute over the Vinaya. And it's not really laid out in detail at all in the Khotanese Arhat prophecy. So I'm a little rusty on the exact details, but basically you have an Arhat and a Bhikshu, and one of them feels disrespected, I think, and then I think slugs the other one and he dies. And so then a disciple gets involved and, retaliates. And then the whole thing, it's just a brawl. And then everyone's dead. And there are these graphic descriptions of like the king of Kauśāmbī coming and seeing the field littered with the bodies of bhikshus. And it's really amazing. So, yeah. And I'll just say that I do think that there could be some echoing of this in the outer frame of the Arhat, because we have at the very, the Khotanese Arhat is talking, he's questioned by a Bhikshu disciple who has been studying the Vinaya and the Chandragarbha Sutra. And for some reason, the Vinaya and the Chandragarbha Sutra propel him to ask this question about the end of the Dharma. So that Arhat Bhikshu angle seems to be worked into the outer frame rather than in Kauśāmbī, like in the original Kauśāmbī versions. But here it gets moved to the frame. I think that's there. So, yeah.
This is a question you may not be able to answer, but someone asks if you've read Kleinkite's work. Which I don't know personally, but I just looked it up, and there's a book, Gnosis on the Silk Road, that bears it all on this topic. I don't know if you've read it.
No, I haven't. Sorry.
And then another question. I'm curious about the Chinese version. Are there major points of departure or peculiarities compared with the Tibetan text?
Yeah, I had to kind of skip over that. The main thing really, so the Chinese version doesn't name the Arhat. The Tibetan versions all name him Sanghavardhana, which is a little bit interesting because there's another text that is parallel but also different called the Prophecy of the Arhat Sanghavardhana. So Sanghavardhana's role in both these prophecies is interesting, but the Chinese doesn't mention that he's named Sanghavardhana. And then the other big one is this, is it Parthia or is it Anshi, the pacified West protectorate? And basically in thinking about it, I think that it might indicate that Fa Cheng was translating this, like 60, 70 years after the Tang protectorate of Anshi was destroyed and fell out of use. And so I actually think that it might reflect this gap where the Khotanese composition at the very least, and likely also the Tibetan translation, are translated quite close to 790, not 790, sorry, 802 or something, but quite close to that date. Whereas then, you know, half a century or more later, we get Fa Chang translating it into Chinese. And we know by, I actually have a slide of this if I can get to it. We know by one of the interesting things is his title here, which I pulled out, is his title here starts with Guo. So during the Tibetan period, his title starts with Da Fan Guo. So Da Fan Guo is the great state of Tibet. And that, my theory, and you know, I'm not sure that I can fully prove it, but it hasn't really been contradicted so far, is that when you're missing the Da Fan, these manuscripts, again, not necessarily the text, but the manuscript itself is after 848 when the Tibetan administration is kicked out of Dunhuang. So that gives us, you know, and then Fa Chang dies around 860. So we really have like a 10-year window when he was doing this translation. But the other interesting thing is that, so in the 840s, the Tibetan Empire collapses, the Uyghur Empire collapses, like the, you know, and then the Tibetans are forced out of Dunhuang. So there's all this like major political shifts going on in the Dunhuang area. That and then also what happens is in 848, when the Tibetans when Dunhuang reestablishes communication with the Tang dynasty, they would have found out about the Huichang persecution of Buddhism in mainland China in 845 and 846. So we're just a few years, you know, we're maybe 10 years at most out from this huge suppression of Buddhism in mainland China. And what's interesting, and I guess I didn't crop this part of the slide, but well, it was on my earlier slides too, but the title of the text in Chinese is a prophecy or a record of the decline of the Dharma. It's not the prophecy of the Arhat of Khotan, which all the Tibetan texts have. So that's also, I think that the Chinese translation is produced in a very different circumstance, in different circumstances than the Tibetan translation. And that's my kind of working hypothesis, is that it has to do with, you know, the Chinese translation really is translated due to all of this upheaval and, you know, all the things we imagine might lead, you know, on the surface might lead to prophesizing the decline of the Dharma, whereas the Khotanese and Tibetan translations were actually doing something different.
Thank you. Okay, another question. Thanks for the great talk. Geza Urai in 1972 distinguishes between the original laws established during the reign of Trimang Lun Mangtsen in 650 to 76, and the attribution of these laws to Trisongtsen at some time during the early 8th century. This seems similar to what you mentioned in your talk as a misattribution of the conquest of Khotan, maybe circa 670 question mark, under Trimang Lun Mangtsen to a conquest during the reign of Trisongtsen. I guess he's saying that both of these have been pushed.
Right, yeah.
The structural prominence and duplication of Tibet within your narrative ring and the appeal to Khotan's Tibetan masters may explain the misdating of the Tibetan conquest of Khotan. I wonder whether you could comment on the feasibility of this and about the feedback loop between Tibetan and Khotanese concerning these concerns in these histories.
Right, yeah, that's kind of the next step that I didn't have time to, but I just think, well, thank you. That's a really interesting comment. Yeah, it seems exactly the same thing as going on, where you have something that Manglung Monsen did is being attributed to Songtsen Gampo down the road. But yeah, I do think that, you know, so obviously, you know, the Tibetans are ruling Khotan, and you know, I do think there's this appeal for protection of some sort being made, but also, you know, Tibet is looking to Khotan, and has been for a long time at this point, for Buddhism, for the Dharma, you know, and I think that those claims, for instance, about Khotan being a center, you know, a center of the Buddhist world, like I think the Tibetans are really accepting those claims. Like I think that it doesn't Sam Van Schaik have an article where I think he opens his article on Tibet and Khotan relations, talking about with a quote from Nyangral Nyimyoser, where he's saying that, talking about how the Buddha taught the Dharma and went to Khotan and taught the Dharma, you know. So Tibetans, I would assume from, you know, the point of view of Tibetans, like Khotan is a holy land. It is full of the Dharma. I mean, the Chinese have been going there for centuries to get sutras that they can't find other places. And, you know, so it is a very complicated dynamic, and it's not just, you know, the Tibetans are political rulers or something, but there is the Dharma is a really important part of this, feedback loop, I guess. Yeah.
Okay, one more. Thanks a lot for your presentation, Meghan. I wonder how you understand the possible connections or differences between Buddhist prophecy narration centered on sites, like your case on Khotan and Tibet, and those on Buddhist figures like the Jataka and Avadana tales on Megha and the child king Ashoka.
Yeah, so I'm not particularly familiar with the tales about Megha and child king Ashoka, but I mean, I do think there is like this genre of prophecy. Basically, I think that that this is a Khotanese genre. You know, in Buddhist literature, we find lots of Vyakaranas, but they are generally, you know, Mahayana sutras in which the Buddha is prophesying that this person is going to going to come to enlightenment. It's a prophecy to enlightenment for a bodhisattva. But then we do have this group of, you know, like I don't know, maybe 3 or 4 of the 6 texts tied to Khotan that survive in Tibetan are prophecies. So I think this really needs to be identified as a Khotanese genre. You know, there's a different thing going on. These aren't just kind of general Indian Mahayana literature. They're not sutras. They are Khotanese prophecies, and Khotan is using prophecy for, you know, and what's neat about it is because of the, you know, Dunhuang, the links to Dunhuang, and you know, because we have these manuscript remains and can date these things so much more tightly than we can for most Mahayana sutras. It's almost like we can see we're watching scripture being created, you know, in front of us, which is something that we often can't do for Mahayana sutras. But on the other hand, we also have to remember that this is really particular to Khotan. And, you know, of course, Khotan might be doing a lot of things that belong to Buddhism in general, but there are also going to be things that are very particular to Khotan. And so we have to really, you know, yeah.
Well, thank you. There's one more question that I'll send you on email with a reference that looks like it might be useful. I'll just mention, it says, regarding the Anse Kwatsi Wang, we have a record about the origin and development of the administrative unit. I can't read Chinese, so, and it says that Anshi is Kucha. So I'll send you that reference, and the person says, hope this can help.
Yeah, thank you very much for that.
Okay, well, it's 1:30, and thank you, Meghan. That was really a very exciting journey you took us on across all of Central Asia, and I really appreciated your use of interesting narrative structures at the same time as deep philological work. It was a very nice combination of it, so thanks. Yeah, and thank you everyone for attending. And thank you again to the Young Clancy family and the scholarship that made this possible.
Yes, thank you. Yeah.